Now, I fully acknowledge that without real amps, virtual amps wouldn't exist. If it wasn't for analog technology improving, virtual amps wouldn't be developing as quick as they are. I think it's also important to mention that the angry analog gear snobs already yelling at me in the comments have some great arguments as to why virtual amps and modelers are inferior and always have been and always will be to the real thing. Here's why they're wrong. Now, this isn't a call for everyone to throw out their hard-earned gear and switch to plugins. To the contrary, I have my biases, but I want to be objective and really look at the pros and cons of both, as I feel like this discussion is way more nuanced than people make it out to be. Part 1. History. For all intents and purposes, we are discussing emulation technology as it exists in the year 2021. There's a lot of history that's led to where we are today, but to me the question has always been, does the gear, virtual or otherwise, analog or digital, enable me to create and then perform music? Throughout the years, music and music production have always moved towards consistency. The first valve amps used by guitarists served one purpose: amplification. Take guitar signal, make loud. But the first time we started using overdrive in our music, it was not a result of innovation, it was a result of us driving those amps to their breaking point and the valves saturating. This eventually led to guitarists even damaging their amps to get more aggressive tones. The elitists didn't like that very much, but we got the blues. Thanks to early innovators, we eventually were able to create these high-gain tones without destroying our expensive amps. But the first guitar pedal as we know it today was the original Fuzzbox. And the fuzz was a tone eventually employed by guitarists like Keith Richards and Jimi Hendrix, leading to basically everyone competing to get these tones. And eventually, we hit the 70s. Elitists didn't like where things were going very much, but we got AC/DC, Van Halen, and Queen. Pretty soon, companies like EMT and Boss gave us digital emulations of some classic analog gear. Old analog reverbs, delays, and choruses sounded great, but were expensive and cumbersome. The elitists protested, but the advent of digital gear ensured that a generation of up-and-coming guitarists could create music for cheaper and were able to recreate it more consistently, giving birth to the 80s. I believe that we are standing on the cusp of one of these moments in time, a modern guitar renaissance. Good music becoming more accessible to young guitarists. And just like many guitarists were against the early guitar effects pedals taking the place of their analog brothers, the modern gear-obsessed amp snob is standing against growth. Part 2. Functionality. My main argument for the use of plugins is versatility. I am a session guitarist, so I often have to jump between jazz, blues, and 80s hair metal within the same day. And as genre barriers become more and more nuanced and less defined, we're not going to consider the opinion of any elitists for now, it makes most sense for a guitarist to have as many different tones at his disposal as possible. Advantage plugins. Surely, Peter, you can't be saying that virtual amps and plugins are better for live music than a good old trusty valve amp. I could maybe concede that they're great for home studio use, but surely not live. I would agree, if I hadn't been using plugins live for the last year and a half and realized that I've been living under a rock for my whole life. I'll discuss the obvious limitations in a second because I know they exist, but let me run through some of the things I've discovered by using plugins instead of an amp. As an amp user, your tone isn't just coming from your amp, but also your cabinet and eventually being picked up by mics. This has to be placed properly, and in live circumstances, anything can go wrong. As a plugin user, my mic placement is happening virtually. Using impulse responses recorded by professionals in perfect conditions means that I don't have to worry about the sound of the room being compromised. But most importantly, I don't have to worry about any other instruments bleeding into my mics. It just works. It is also important to mention that if you are recording an amp and you have effects running through it and that is its tone, that is set in stone once recorded. With plugins, a raw DI can be changed into anything depending on what the producer needs. As a real amp user, you have to haul about 6 metric tons of gear to and from rehearsals and gigs, and I'm not even gonna get into the costs of flying gigs. As a plugin user, I get to show up with a guitar and a backpack. Most significantly, as a real amp user, you have to keep turning down your amp so the vocalist can hear himself in the mirror. Let us not forget that valve amps famously only really work properly when they're gunned at full volume. That's absolutely fine if you're Brian May, not so much if you're you. As a plugin user, I get consistent tones in any part of the gain spectrum, and I can send all of my tones, cab sims, and impulse responses straight to the engineer. I spend a lot of my time playing with classical musicians, often seated right next to a cellist. In those situations, there are a lot of really sensitive live mics on stage, and it is really valuable to have a completely silent rig. And I'm not the first guitarist to have this problem. Guthrie Govan used the Kemper when he was performing with Hans Zimmer. The engineer doesn't have to fight from any of my sound coming from stage, and most importantly, everyone I'm performing with can have the appropriate amount of guitar in their monitors, leading to all of us hearing each other and performing better. Now, I've often heard comments to the effect of plugins being too complicated. A valve amp is simple, you just plug your guitar in and you turn it on. Now, I plan to make a full video about my live tone and how I go about using plugins live, but the short version is very much guitar interface plugin. Amps, on the other hand, have a million little things that you really should be considering. Valves will need rebiasing and eventually need to be swapped out, turning an already expensive amp into a consistent expense. Not to mention that the same people telling me my tone is too complicated are running into pedal boards with 20 odd pedals on them, all of which react differently to each other and the amps you're going to be using them with. And if you're talking valve heads, you're also talking about using the appropriate cabs. Otherwise, you stand at risk of everything destroying itself because of science. Plugins, on the other hand, work right out of the box. Now finally, here is my main argument for virtual over analog, and I dare anyone to disagree with me. Part 3. Wow, it's expensive. For the following examples, I will be referring to the archetype Nolly by Neural DSP. Let's do some quick maths. How much would you need to pay for the analog gear represented virtually in the archetype Nolly? 4 emulations of different amps modified by Adam Nolly Get Good. A clean amp reminiscent of a Fender, an amp with some gain reminiscent of something by Marshall, a high gain amp that by all accounts is reminiscent of a 5150, and a 4th that is modeled after something like a Victory Kraken. 4 cabinet simulations. A compressor, a drive pedal reminiscent of a tube screamer, a delay before the amp, and another drive pedal. 2-button delay with a tap tempo and a reverb, and an EQ. Now we move on to mics. You also have the ability to mic up your amp with 4 different mics, and you can do it twice. That's 8 microphones. Wow. That brings our total at time of recording to about... Whereas the archetype Nolly by Neural DSP retails for approximately $149. With it, I can play almost any genre with the appropriate tones. To me, that is the easiest math equation I will ever do. Now that we all agree that I am objectively right, I would like to concede some ground. A while back, Rick Beato brought up an absolutely incredible point in one of his videos, the importance of your tone journey.
Okay, so why do you need all this stuff? Why do you need all these amplifiers? Some people use the term tone chaser, people that are always experimenting, trying to find that sound that they hear in their head. One of the things that they did was go out and search for their own sound. Now, you could say, well, can't you just get these same sounds out of digital gear? I say, well, you can get different sounds out of digital gear, but essentially, when you're using some type of modeling device, you're basically using the same algorithms as everyone else. You're using the same amplifier algorithms, the same speaker simulators, same mics that are on them. You know, you might have different impulse responses, but essentially everybody's using the same stuff.
There is something genuinely magical about buying a new pedal or a piece of gear and exploring it. Learning how it responds to other pieces of gear in your rig, leading to a unique tone only you have. Rick pointed out that every Instagram guitarist pretty much sounds the same, because all of them are using the same plugins, the same ones and zeros, the same emulations of the same perfect studio environment. The classic tones we all aspire to, Brian May, John Mayer, Angus Young, Jimi Hendrix, Eric Clapton, the list goes on, all of them got there through a journey. It is for that reason that I recommend that young guitarists combine different tools and test out different things to achieve what they're looking for, instead of just downloading a profile or a preset that somebody else made. That being said, this is not a problem exclusive to plugin users. If we're being fair, the use of presets is exactly what analog snobs have been doing for years. Every single tone snob I know have some combination of a Marshall amp and a tube screamer for their main tone. I used to think I need a Vox AC30 and a treble booster to sound objectively good. You can find thousands of examples of amp snobs on YouTube explaining what combination is the perfect and objectively right tone for whatever criteria. Once again, as we've seen through history, the problem isn't really the technology, but the attitude of the guitarists. I think it's really important for a guitarist to find a unique voice, regardless of whether or not they're using analog gear or a plugin. That being said, I think the absolute best way to use virtual gear is in combination with hardware. If you're going to be using plugins live, you're going to want to combine that with a foot switch. Look into using pre and post interface effects like reverbs and delays, having them right in front of you in a physical pedal. Because honestly, fiddling with a mouse pad is the last thing you want to do during a gig. It can really ruin the flow of your performance and lead to unexpected problems when time is of the essence. Honestly, if you have the money, maybe skip computers and plugins entirely and just use modelers like the Kemper. Neural DSP just released what a lot of people are calling the new standard and modeling in the quad cortex. My argument isn't really that plugins are better than amps, just more versatile and innovative and cheaper and more conducive to a growing industry. So better. Thank you so much for watching. If you are an analog gear snob, I would love to hear what you have to say in the comments. I really wanted to make this video because honestly, less than 5 years ago, virtual amps did not measure up at all. But it has become more and more prevalent to myself as a session guitarist that just often the plugins just sound better than amps to me sometimes. If you like this video and you feel like anything I said made sense, send it to a fellow tone enthusiast. I think this is an important conversation. If you hated this video because I'm an idiot who clearly doesn't understand anything about guitar tone, also share it. Finally, please subscribe. Like I mentioned, I will be making a video where I run through using plugins live. I'm really excited for that. Okay, bye.